worst thing you've seen at a wedding? Sarah's husband, Mike, had a colleague named Jim who was getting married. Jim was one of those guys who always had a story to tell, and his wedding was no exception. The main characters in this tale were Jim's bride, Lisa, and Jim's mother, Brenda. Now, Brenda was a piece of work. She had that kind of icy, overbearing presence that could make you feel like you were back in school, getting scolded by the principal. Everyone in their social circle knew there was no love lost between Lisa and Brenda. It was the kind of mutual disdain that could make holiday dinners feel like a high-stakes poker. The thing is, Jim was pretty tight-lipped about the whole situation. He loved his mom, but he also adored Lisa, and he tried to keep the peace as much as possible. It was like watching a tightrope walker, constantly balancing, trying not to fall into the abyss of family drama. His work friends, including Mike, knew there was tension, but they didn't really expect anything to blow up, especially not on the wedding day. The ceremony itself was held at this beautiful little church on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that felt almost magical, with stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the pews, and an organ that sounded like it was being played by angels. The weather was perfect too, clear skies and just the right amount of breeze to keep things comfortable. As everyone gathered, there was this palpable sense of excitement in the air. Weddings do that, you know? They bring out this mix of joy, hope, and a touch of nervousness. People were mingling, chatting, and admiring the decorations. Brenda, however, was a different story. She stood off to the side, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. Every now and then she'd glance at Lisa, and those looks could have frozen lava. Lisa, for her part, was doing her best to ignore Brenda, focusing on the happiness of the day. When the ceremony began, it was picture perfect. The bridal party walked down the aisle. The flower girls scattered petals with all the seriousness of a seasoned professional, and then came Lisa. She looked stunning, like a vision in her white dress, a smile that could light up a room. Jim's face when he saw her was something to behold. Pure love and admiration. For a moment it seemed like nothing could go wrong. But, as they say, the calm before the storm is always deceptive. Brenda, sitting in the front row, had a look on her face that was hard to read. It wasn't happiness, that was for sure. As the officiant went through the motions, there were these subtle exchanges of glances between Lisa and Brenda. It was like a silent battle of wills, each refusing to back down. Things started to get really interesting when it came time for the vows. Jim and Lisa had written their own, and they were beautiful, heartfelt words that had a few guests dabbing at their eyes. But then, as Lisa was about to finish hers, Brenda let out this little, almost imperceptible scoff. It was quiet enough that not everyone heard it, but those who did exchanged nervous glances. Lisa didn't miss a beat. She kept her composure, finishing her vows with a steady voice. Jim, sensing the undercurrent of tension, squeezed her hand reassuring. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The rest of the ceremony went off without a hitch, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the worst was over. But, as everyone would soon find out, the real drama was just about to begin. The reception was where things truly unraveled, where the masks people wore during the ceremony started to slip, and the true colors came out in vivid detail. But then, there was Brenda. She started off slow, mingling and making small talk, but it didn't take long before she found her way to the bar. Now Brenda wasn't the type to hold back when it came to her opinions, and with each drink her filter seemed to disappear a little more. She began making snide comments to her relatives and friends, loud enough for anyone within earshot to hear. "Can you believe the nerve of her?" she hissed, her eyes darting towards Lisa, "acting like she's queen of the world just because she snagged my son." People started to notice, and whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Jim, ever the peacemaker, pulled his mom aside. I imagine their conversation went something like this. "Mom, please," Jim pleaded, his voice low but firm. "Not today. Just try to get along for my sake." Brenda, with a dramatic sigh, promised to behave, and for a brief moment it seemed like the storm had passed. But as the night wore on, the toasts began, and with them, Brenda's resolve seemed to weaken. Every time someone mentioned Lisa's name, Brenda made these loud, obnoxious noises, scoffs, exaggerated sighs, and even a few muttered insults. It was embarrassing, but most people did their best to ignore her, trying to keep the focus on the happy couple. The dancing started, and the guests began to relax again, swaying to the music and enjoying the festivities. Brenda, however, kept moving around, talking to different people, her discontent simmering just below the surface. It was like watching a volcano. You knew it was only a matter of time before it erupted. The tipping point came during the cake cutting. The bridesmaids were circulating around the room, offering pieces of the beautifully decorated wedding cake to the guests. When they reached Brenda's table, she waved them off with a dismissive hand. "I don't want any," she snapped, her voice sharp. The chief bridesmaid, a sweet girl named Emily, smiled and nodded. "No problem, Mrs. Johnson. I'll just leave some here for anyone else at the table." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "I told you I don't want any fucking wedding cake," she shouted, her voice cutting through the cheerful hum of the reception like a knife. Before anyone could react, she swept her arm across the table, sending the pieces of cake flying. One piece landed squarely on Emily's dress, smearing frosting and ruining the delicate fabric. Emily, usually composed and gentle, had reached her limit. She stood up, her face flushed with anger. "What the hell is your problem, Brenda?" she shouted back. And that was all it took. Brenda sprang to her feet, her face a mask of fury. She slapped Emily, the sound echoing across the room. Gasps filled the air as people turned to see what was happening. It was like a spark in a room full of gasoline. Guests began to choose sides, voices rising in a chaotic blend of accusations and defenses. Jim rushed over, trying to separate his mother and Emily. "Mom, stop it!" he yelled, but Brenda was beyond reason. Lisa joined in, her own temper flaring as she defended her friend. "You need to leave, Brenda, now!" Chaos ensued. Some guests tried to calm things down, while others, fueled by alcohol and a sense of loyalty, jumped into the fray. It was a mess of shouting, shoving, and more than a few spilled drinks. In the midst of it all, Sarah and Mike stood back, watching in stunned silence. "Can you believe this?" Sarah whispered to Mike, who shook his head, a grim look on his face. "This is going to be the talk of the office for years," he muttered. Eventually, security was called, and Brenda was escorted out, still screaming insults and threats. The reception limped on, but the mood was irreparably damaged. What should have been a joyous celebration had turned into a spectacle of family dysfunction. As the night drew to a close, Sarah and Mike made their way home, the events replaying in their minds. "I can't imagine how Jim and Lisa are feeling right," Sarah said softly. "Yeah," Mike agreed, "but one thing's for sure. This is a wedding no one will ever forget." The scene at the reception was pure chaos. My sister-in-law, Sarah, had a front-row seat to the spectacle, watching with a mix of horror and fascination. She and Mike were on the sidelines, eyes wide as the drama unfolded. They had never seen anything like it, and honestly, neither had I when she later recounted the events to me. As Brenda continued to scream and shout, Jim and his best man, a solid, no-nonsense guy named Steve, decided enough was enough. They made their way to the DJ booth, cutting the music mid-song. The sudden silence was jarring and everyone froze, the reality of the situation sinking in. "All right, everyone, that's it!" Jim's voice boomed across the room, cutting through the tension. "The wedding is over. Thank you all for coming, but it's time to go." The guests looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. Brenda, still fuming, opened her mouth to say something, but Jim silenced her with a steely glare. "Mum," he said, his voice cold and final, "I never want to see you again." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Brenda's face crumpled, a mix of anger and pain flashing across her features. But Jim was resolute. He turned to Lisa, took her hand in his, and without another word, they walked out of the reception hall, leaving a stunned crowd in their wake. Sarah told me that in that moment you could have heard a pin drop. Everyone was in shock, trying to process what had just happened. It was like the end of a dramatic movie, but this was real life, and the fallout was going to be messy. Mike, always the practical one, nudged Sarah. "We should go," he said quietly, "before things get even worse." Sarah nodded, still a bit dazed by the events. They gathered their things and made their way to the exit, along with a steady stream of other guests who had decided it was time to leave. As they walked to their car, Sarah couldn't help but glance back at the estate, now lit only by the twinkling lights that seemed strangely out of place given the evening's drama. On the drive home, they talked about what had happened, dissecting every detail. "I can't believe Jim cut his mom off like that," Sarah said, shaking her head. "But I guess she kind of had it coming." Mike sighed. "Yeah, it was a long time coming. Still, it's sad to see a family torn apart like that." Sarah agreed, and they spent the rest of the drive in contemplative silence, the weight of the night's events heavy in the air.